Hi there, welcome back to the Brussels Signal Studio. This is Peter Cattle. I'm Justin Stairs, and you'll be watching episode 3 of the Brussels Signal Digital Podcast. We're here to talk about artificial intelligence and, in particular, the European Union AI Act. Okay, so it's August, and therefore the AI Act has come into force. Is that right?
Kind of. Well, it's officially now on the books, but we're only going to feel the first impacts of that in 6 months' time. And that's going to be an effective ban on anything that provides an unacceptable risk in the EU's mind.
Can you give me an example of an unacceptable risk?
In their press release, they came up with a number of examples. One's like AIs that encourage dangerous behaviors in minors. So they gave the example of a toy that tells children to do dangerous and illegal things. Anything that can be used for social scoring for either governments or even companies. And predictive policing is another thing they're very scared of that they've outright banned. And that's the first thing that's going to come into force. After that, in the 12-month period, we're going to see restrictions on general purpose AI as well. So think the likes of ChatGPT, that sort of thing.
And what's wrong with predictive policing?
Well, they believe that it represents an unacceptable violation of human rights. So at the core of a lot of this AI Act, and we covered this quite extensively in the run-up to it being passed, is that AI, as it exists today in the minds of a lot of bureaucrats in the city, is something that poses a threat to European citizens. It could violate their rights in the sense of how powerful it is. Now, of course, a lot of companies here have very different points of view on that.
Right. It's just I mentioned predictive policing because doesn't that exist in the US? Haven't they? I think they've been experimenting with it for a while.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why they want to get rid of it. And in effect, though, how there are carve-outs for a lot of these restrictions, as there usually are within EU legislation. But it was cited that the failure of predictive policing in the US, in terms of AI scanning of faces, that sometimes it gets it wrong. You end up arresting someone totally erroneously, and that's obviously not good for the person arrested who's completely innocent. So their argument is, this is dangerous. We're going to close this Pandora's box before it can open.
And so the first wave of measures as exemplified there by the European Commission, I mean, is that going to make any difference? I doubt that there are many toys on the market telling babies to go and commit crimes, are there?
Well, yes, this is this is a feature, not a bug, in the minds of the European Commission, in the sense of it's being billed as the first general regulation on AI. The EU is once again being a trendsetter here, so they want to be what's the term they use? Regulatory superpower. They're going to set the regulations in line with EU values, and everyone else is going to copy it. So think of like GDPR, for example, where they set the rules.
That's copyright legislation.
Suddenly, California came out with something very similar, and they're patting themselves on the back, saying, "Look at us, aren't we so important?" Effectively, but in general, the AI Act is going to be fully enforced more or less by August 2026.
That's in 12 months' time. And so what, 24 months. So, and what will the difference be then? What kind of changes to the marketplace are we going to see?
Well, that's an interesting question. On paper, the AI Act is extremely complicated, and we could talk about it for hours and still only scratch the surface. But there is an element here that there's certain people within the Commission that seem to be getting buyer's remorse with this act. Chief amongst which seems to be Gabriele Mazzini, who's the European Commission's chief architect for the legislation. He was one of the main people negotiating it within the trilogue, which was the negotiation between European Parliament and the European Council. And the Commission kind of gets in between.
Right.
He's come out and talked to Bloomberg in a recent interview and said, well, we initially planned this legislation as a way of flattening the playing field, making sure that EU companies have a chance against the big shots from the US. And now he's worried that it's going to have the opposite effect, that, well, actually, entrenched players are going to have a much bigger advantage in this highly regulated market compared to upstarts within Europe.
And that's because they're not facing the same regulation.
They're facing the same regulation, but it's an economy of scale, effectively. A number of analysts have reckoned that the cost of complying with this act for any particular company could cost you between 100,000 and 150,000 euro. So if you are a big business like of Alphabet, owner of Google, like of Meta, you can afford that. Like
right.
that's it's a cost, but it's a cost you can manage. If you're a small to medium enterprise now, well, it's a different story. It's more complicated.
I guess this is the case, is it not, with all EU legislation, depending on the compliance costs. If there is a cost, obviously the big boys can afford it more than the little boys. But what about this argument that the EU will actually dampen enthusiasm for AI in the European Union, whereas in China or the US, where they're less regulated markets, they will forge ahead? Is that a valid argument in your opinion?
Well, it already seems to be happening. It hasn't even been fully implemented yet, and Meta and Apple have come out and said we're delaying products and their entry into the European Union because we have to comply with these acts, and that's going to take time. Apple in particular had much hyped features coming out in their iPhone platform, and it looks like, according to The Verge, that's not going to happen until after the end of this year. So that's a substantial delay compared to the United States. And personally, the one I always think about is Google's Bard AI. Right now, if you are in the United States, and any of our viewers from there can try it, if you Google anything, you'll get a response from Bard alongside your normal search results. Now, some people like it, some people hate it, but it's there. If you do that in Europe, you don't get that. In fact, compared to the Google service we had at the beginning of the year, in my view anyway, it's worse, because I don't know if you've ever tried to search up a location of a restaurant or a building that you want to go to. I personally always just did it in Google. It would automatically say, hey, you want to go to our Maps app, and I just click the Maps app and I don't have to think about it. That doesn't work anymore, and that doesn't work anymore because of the Digital Markets Act. Basically, the Digital Markets Act forces companies not to abuse their market position, and that means Google has had to segregate effectively a lot of its apps. That includes their search app and their Maps app. So we're already seeing, as a result of these big European regulations that have come in over the last 18 months, effectively, a dampening of a technology from even the big players in these sectors, even the likes of Meta, even the likes of Google, even the likes of Apple, let alone the smaller players. But we're seeing that from the smaller players too.
On that, why don't we go to a quick video. Phidias Panayotou, an MEP from Cyprus who was in this studio not that long ago, he had something to say on this subject. Let's hear it. What extent do we regulate, stop it? And to what extent do we just kind of like keep an eye on it? But there's another one, in fact.
But Europe, they are...
You can say that here.
They are...
No problem.
We're stopping the... why always the innovation is in United States or in China?
Okay.
Why they are always because we're doing something wrong with the regulation. We're not attracting the right companies and all this stuff. We need to be more encouraged of this stuff, because that's the most important race, I think, in human history. And if we stay behind, maybe we completely stay behind and
forever.
Forever. So it's like a game that we need to be careful. Yeah. So
the last.
I love you, Europe.
So, do you agree with that sentiment?
Well, in terms of Phidias, since coming to the city, has generated quite a bit of controversy. I don't think I've ever seen an MEP generate the same kind of traction he has within a few months, and he's new to the political game. But I think it's worth pointing out that this man fundamentally is a businessman. He has made his livelihood on modern social media, on modern technological platforms. And here he is coming out going, we're at risk of falling behind. We're at risk of regulating ourselves out of the market. And it seems like what he's saying is coming through. Like he's a YouTuber. He puts most of his content on YouTube. And as we've said, Google is curtailing its offerings here to comply with EU regulation.
So you do agree, essentially?
I think it's very hard not to. Now, the question is, what's the value in that? Now, a lot of people within the European Parliament, for example, will say that, well, these regulations protect users. They protect European citizens, and that's what's most important. And businesses lose a few percentage points in terms of economic growth, perhaps, but that's a cost that's worth paying. Now, I struggle to see that personally, especially in how competitive an environment we currently internationally. We're increasingly seeing a level of multipolarity. There's a big competition in the AI market between China and the US, but it's also broadening. Russia's involved, India's involved, the United Kingdom especially, post-Brexit is involved, and everyone likes saying, oh, Brexit's been a disaster for this, that and the other reasons, but it has given the country a little bit of extra wriggle room on these business endeavours, and it looks like they're, at least from the Conservative government, they were trying to take it. We don't know where the Labour government's going to go with this, but chances are there'll probably be a lot of continuity there. And the EU seems to be falling behind in this race rather rapidly. I can't help but think of the example of Mistral AI, which was Paris's AI darling. Now, during the negotiations for the AI Act, France, the Macron government, was said to have been desperately trying to get carve-outs for the likes of Mistral, saying that this is the future of European AI. It was a totally independent developer of an AI product, and it showed a lot of promise. Now, they got some cutouts. It seemed like they didn't get as much as they were hoping for. But only a few weeks, effectively, after arranging this, Mistral announced it was entering a partnership with Microsoft. So no longer
independent.
No.
On the subject of international competition, we have a graph. Let's have a look at it, which does reinforce the points you've been making about the lack of innovation already in the AI sphere in the European Union compared to other countries. There we go. US by far in the lead, followed by China, and we're talking about unicorns valued at $1 billion or more, with the EU there less than half of China's value.
Actually, let's look at the United Kingdom and Singapore there. Combined, they almost have as much as the EU does, and they're a fraction of the size, especially Singapore. Of course, India is a developing economy. It's neck and neck. Now, a much larger population, as is China, but obviously the United States dominates. And the United States dominates, I'd argue, because it's an open capitalist system where, regulation does exist, but it's cheaper to navigate. Now, of course, it would be remiss not to mention the EU has certain disadvantages. Linguistic diversity compared to the United States is quite a lot higher. Compared to China, it's moderately higher, I'd say. Compared to India, well, it's probably a little bit more neck and neck on that regards. But there's definitely an element here, and I think it'd be very hard not to see that EU regulation is getting in the way of these economies, these developed economies, showing their true potential.
Well, I guess if you had some money and wanted to start up somewhere, it's probably logical that you would see higher compliance costs starting up in the EU.
Like
right?
I was at an industry event late last year while the AI Act was still being drafted. And I remember talking to people who were in these AI startups. They hadn't become a unicorn yet. That's a big achievement to do that. But they were getting in and they were ambitious. And I remember one standing up in front of a panel to ask a question. And there was one MEP on it and a number of other regulators, and going, if the AI Act passes the way we're hearing it would, and it ended up doing so, I will have to go to the US. And it wasn't I dislike you or I dislike the Europe. It was one of the things they were very insistent on. I was like, no, I'm pro-European. I like Europe, but I will have to go. Now, I don't know if he ended up, following through on that. That might have been a bit of a song and a dance to try and, pull back on those regulations. But even the fact that he felt like he had to make that appeal to a MEP involved in the drafting this legislation, I think says enough, really.
Okay, all right. Well, that's the entrepreneur's argument, or the argument from the point of view of an entrepreneur. Let's try and examine then the other side of the equation. Obviously, going back to the European Commission press release, they say they're looking to avoid some nasty potential applications, social scoring by governments or companies. This is the Black Mirror episode, of course, where if your score's not sufficient, you won't be able to book a flight or something like that. Maybe you won't get credit. I mean, isn't that fair enough?
I'd argue that we probably shouldn't be regulating for things that might happen. I don't think there is any there's any EU legislation, though I could be wrong, about what to do if an extraterrestrial invasion occurred. It's technically possible. We don't know if there's aliens or not, but we don't have legislation for it. It's like, why? Like, we don't know if this sort of system is feasible. Like, there's other comparisons here going, oh well, part of this legislation sounds like it's trying to regulate Skynet from the Terminator series. But again, we don't know if these systems are actually feasible. Like, AI is still in its infancy here as an industry. We don't know what's achievable. Some people think that we're heading towards artificial general intelligence. That could happen in the next 3-4 years. And some people think, so actually, no, we've already hit the height. It's not going to get any more extreme than this. But what we are seeing is that even with the technology we have now, we're unlocking new uses for it in various businesses that many of which we haven't thought of, in the last 6 months. Like, it is a very fast-moving industry, and strangling it in the crib with regulation.
But surely, though, nobody wants social scoring. I mean, we all saw that episode of Black Mirror. We didn't like what we saw, did we?
Well, in terms of, we don't know. Well, again, that's an extreme example. Like, what counts as social scoring? Like, what's this going to look like in an EU courtroom? Is, for example, if some country decides to create a totally voluntary, fitness program or something that would, use AI to see if you did like a 2-kilometer run every week and would reward you with something frivolous there. I don't know, cinema points or something. Would that be illegal? Maybe, maybe not. It hasn't been tested yet. Should we not see what these countries do first before we come down with a ban hammer?
Okay, so you're saying ban post-fact rather than a priori?
Probably. Like, in terms of the United States, from what I've seen, hasn't fallen apart due to AI yet. Neither is China. Again, we hear a lot of fear about social credit scores in China, and I'm not going to discount what the Chinese Communist Party does to political dissidents. But that white paper that the social credit score system that comes from was never implemented. It was one section of the CCP wrote it, and it was put in a drawer and never used again.
Oh, well, I thought I've seen online evidence of people not being able to book train tickets.
Yes, but that is far more manual. It's not a case of if you go below a certain level of points, you're no longer allowed to book trains. They do, and I don't want to discount this. There are issues with human rights in China. I'm not saying there isn't, but the kind of omnipresent Skynet style monitoring, it's just simply not in place.
Okay. So you're fairly optimistic about the technology.
Well, I definitely want to. I'm more along the lines of the old adage: move fast, break things, and then when they're broken, we can look at it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Which is very much a US attitude and not a European one, or maybe a bit more in the UK. But
definitely more of a US attitude, though. Again, we saw that unicorn chart. Guess the country with all the unicorns.
Right.
The country with a substantially higher
So
growth.
if what you say is true, though, it's too late now because the Act is in force.
Of course it's not too late. Well, listen, we have a new European Parliament. We're in a new legislative session. Now, it's far more conservative. It does, if you add up the EPP with all the parties who it's further right, they do have a majority now. Is that a functional majority? No, because the EPP doesn't seem to get along with the parties to its right all that well. But it is there. Now, will the council change over the next 5 years? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. But it is quite possible that over the next 5 years, we could see a substantial shift to, if not the right, then to a more, pro-competition, form of council.
Sure, things can change, but I mean, the next 5 years are going to be crucial in the development of AI.
Oh yes, listen, the best time to start any sort of investment is yesterday. The next best is today, and neither seem possible at the moment. Mr. Mazzani, as I referenced earlier, seems to already have buyer's remorse about how extensive this legislation is and the problems that could cause. At this stage, it is probably about limiting the damage, and then in terms of, obviously, for EU leaders, if carve-outs can be made to allow certain elements of EU industry to remain competitive in this new world.
Okay, final question in terms of AI. People like Mr. Musk obviously are experimenting in the field, and you've mentioned already some of the products that will not be available in the EU. Concretely speaking, we have a bit more detail? You mentioned Bard. Is there another one you can give?
Well, just as we were coming on our air, our Irish Data Protection Commissioner announced it was taking Twitter, the company, not the platform, though it owns the platform, to the Irish High Court over its training of the Grok AI using X social media posts. They reckon this is in violation not of any of the new regulations, but actually of GDPR, which we talked about earlier.
The copyright legislation.
They're saying that, well, it's not just the copyright legislation, it's also data protection in the sense of, you have to give consent in terms of for data to be used in certain ways.
Yes.
They're arguing that isn't sufficiently being done. People aren't protected. Therefore, the training of this could be illegal. Now, of course, court case hasn't happened yet. I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but that's what they're claiming. We're already seeing these kind of restrictions being imposed. Again, what's happening in terms of, we don't know how long it will take to roll out these products. Apple and Meta, neither of them have said they've given up on rolling out their AI products to Europe, but they've been delayed. Europe is already substantially behind on these issues, today. Now, what does that mean for small businesses that would benefit from being able to draft, a simple email or a simple mass email for marketing? What's the knock-on economic effect of that? And, a lot of this stuff sounds very, cold and harsh. It's like, these rules are there to protect people. Well, a lot of European citizens are struggling at the moment to heat their homes. They're struggling to buy food. They're struggling with, inflation slowed down slightly, but it's still, we're still reeling from the inflation the last 2-3 years. And if these technologies, through productivity increases, would have given them a few more euro in their pocket, they would definitely welcome them.
Right. You're talking about the knock-on effect on economic growth.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, just on the Twitter court case, this court case is based on allegations, correct me if I'm wrong, that whatever you write on X is being used to train artificial intelligence. It's
trained on AI posts, or not AI posts. It's being trained on user posts, users within EU who avail of protections under GDPR and more broadly EU law.
Right. Okay. Great. Thanks for the update, Peter. That was the Brussels Signal Digital Podcast. Join us for the next one.